before, and thanks for joining us for these weekly conversations about, well, how not to waste a crisis as a bit of a prompter, a provocateur in a sense. So we are trying to depart from this kind of concentrated moment of government experimentation, and we are trying to kind of pose questions about how we respond, both in the short and the longer term. And in the previous weeks, we've had big topics like focusing on the social contract, leadership, how we experiment, futures thinking, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought maybe this was the right time to kind of slow down, inspired by Dan Hill's papers. And I guess one way of kind of thinking about the slowdown is certainly in economic terms. We have a whole economic system kind of slowing down, something we probably didn't think was possible, which is in itself extremely interesting. But I guess more specifically for this session, that's one question or one thematic. We are kind of, as I mentioned, inspired by Dan Hill's kind of tremendous writing in terms of reflecting on this particular time, which I think for him, as for many of us, slowing down has meant kind of getting a chance to get a bit of perspective, maybe even reframing kind of a sense of possibility, getting touch of our values, kind of identifying some signals for new directions potentially. And we're really happy also that a lot of you actually shared some reflections on what this has meant for you before the session. And some of the responses are highly personal in terms of transformation. Some of them are how we collectively do things. Some of them are more related to how we actually think about the big challenges that we're facing. But for this session, we wanted to focus on, let's say, our economic life, where we work, where we play, where we consume, how we live, how we coexist. And maybe also how we distribute resources in our societies. So the bigger question is there a need for slowing down a way of life? Is there a new kind of development? And I can't really think of anyone better to explore this with than Dan Hill, who's the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, Cassie Robinson, who's the Senior Head at TNL Community Fund and a co-founder of the Point People, and Charlie Leadbeater, who is an author and a public innovation thinker, inspiring this field for decades at this point. So this is the session. Dan is going to take over. He's going to talk from his papers in a second. He's going to be followed by Charlie and Cassie, giving their input and reflections. And then we're going to have some time for questions, reflection, and group conversation. So hopefully that all makes sense. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dan, to get us going. And thanks so much for being with us.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. I'm getting a little bit of echo from someone. There we go. That's probably yes, but thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak about this. Although, careful what you wish for, because I only wrote this about 2 weeks ago, so it's so fresh. I don't know how to talk about it in public, so I'm about to find out how that goes. And you are as well, so we're in an experiment together. But yeah, thank you for talking about it. Ironically, for talking about slowdown, I'm going to go quite fast, just so that I can try and get through the kind of arc of the papers that I wrote. And it's just worth saying as well that the nice thing about giving a talk like this is that I've already written it all down. So if you want to go and find something or find a reference, or you think, where's that picture from? Or it's all up there at Medium, or if you Google for slowdown papers, I guess you'll find it. So I'll go fast in a way, and I may not, credit all the images and things like that. So forgive me in advance, but I'll try to do that. But you can find it all online. So I'll just take 15 minutes to try and get through this arc of what I was talking about. And just briefly, my background, just worth saying, I work at Vinnova, which is part of the Swedish government. We're responsible for coordinating the innovation ecosystems in Sweden. I'm not talking on behalf of the government right now, I'm talking as me. Obviously, identities are a bit blurry, so I'll no doubt say some things to do with Swedish government, but I'm speaking in this way effectively, and so this isn't anything to do with policy or a Swedish position on things. As you can tell by my accent, I'm not even Swedish anyway. My background, very briefly, is a designer, this kind of stuff, urban design, urban strategy, products, services, libraries, campuses, blah, blah, blah. Over the years, I got more and more interested in the conditions that create those things and how that's part of the design process. And I use this quote from Madeleine Albright, who is the Secretary of State in, let's say, a very different type of US administration to what we have now. It's almost a classic quote now. We're taking 21st century challenges and evaluating with 20th century ideas and responding with 19th century tools. It's exactly the same in the kind of design that I was doing on those previous things, but it's certainly the same in government quite often. Not to say that's all bad, sometimes some good 19th century ideas, but they're misaligned, I guess is the point, and we need to be very aware of that. So that's just a framing. And so when this crisis started happening, I was part of a WhatsApp group that Brenton and a few others are, I guess, are on as well. And we were, I guess, observing this from early January, one way or another. And I was very struck by, these early images of people wearing masks, because I'd actually started writing this series in around about Christmas. And when people were wearing masks for different reasons, this is in the bushfires in Australia that started, I guess, November, December, ran through January. And they were grabbing the world's attention briefly for some of that time, although in a slightly absent-minded way, I guess, as often the case, except in Australia, of course, where it was sort of apocalyptic. And I was thinking, okay, this is a continental scale climate event. Surely this will be one that the world notices and really thinks deeply about how we have to change in order to prevent this kind of climate crisis at global scale. This is something where you again had people wearing masks and things, with like the most basic human thing of breathing was being encumbered by masks, and you had the worst air quality in the world in Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra for a few days and weeks. And the smoke from the bushfires, basically reached all the way to Argentina. So this is kind of extraordinary, running across something the scale of the Pacific. As Brenton knows, this is the wind blowing in the other direction to him, so he's okay in South Australia. But they were going right across the world, and yet the world didn't really pay attention to this. And I started writing because I thought, okay, we have to observe this thing. And part of being a designer is observing, part of being a researcher is observing, part of being a human is observing. But we need to, sort of like write it into memory. And I was doing that specifically because I was in the floods in Brisbane, actually, when I used to live in Australia in 2011, when the city quickly looked like this over a matter of hours and shut down for a few days. We were without electricity for a few days where I was living. I was writing by iPad until the battery ran out, by candlelight, which is a very strange kind of situation, and writing about that at the time. And again, I was trying to understand what the hell was going on in real time, but then knowing that within about 2 weeks, Brisbane had sort of forgotten. As soon as the floodwaters receded, during the flood, people were saying, okay, we have to take 100-year floods are now every 10 years. The city is built in a floodplain, as most cities are built around river systems. So we shouldn't really be building condos down by the riverbank. Literally within 2 to 3 weeks of the waters disappearing, all those plans were back in action, and it was as if it had never happened. And so I wanted to write about that, to record it. And then COVID happened. And so the same thought kept occurring. I don't mean to have a go at Australia specifically, just to be clear, like we're all in this one together. But this is also where Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, who handled the bushfires incredibly badly, I think is popular opinion, is the guy that held up a lump of coal in the Australian Parliament a few years ago and said this is nothing to be afraid of. So there's a kind of a form to particular countries like Australia, the UK, and the US that we have to call out here. But still. So when COVID started happening, as you all know, we started also seeing these curves, and these curves were sort of interesting because they were a way of drawing a virus, which is incredibly hard if you actually try and draw that funny little thing with the suckers on it. It's not really easy to do that. So the image that became clear in people's heads was this sort of curve flattening, which I thought was super interesting because it's sort of describing a systemic response that relies on a lot of collective action in order to achieve an outcome together. I mean, effectively exactly the same thing that we've been trying to talk about with climate crisis most clearly. And that's not accidental. It's because, to me anyway, and to many researchers who know a lot more about zoonotic diseases than I do, the emergence of COVID is the same pattern of development, due to the same pattern of development as climate crisis. They're basically the same things. So deforestation, biodiversity degradation, urban sprawl, globalized trade networks, over-tourism, all of those things, you know, dirty transport systems, both create climate crisis and the increased incidence of zoonotic diseases. It's the same thing. So the response can be the same as well. If this is the way we deal with the virus, you're thinking, well, maybe there's a way that thinking about this of also dealing with the climate crisis. And this immediately struck some people's head, not my graph, but that thought obviously was being talked about from the UN down. It feels almost a little bit funny talking about it right now, I must say, because I guess I drew this a month ago. And it already feels like a window has closed a little bit. I don't know how people feel. Maybe we can talk about that. A month ago, it was a little bit clearer that we could talk in this way about colliding our response to Corona in order to basically address climate in a way that we hadn't done before. I'm just not sure that that message is enough around. And to me, I started drawing out these things and saying, okay, if we need to hold this red line, this red dotted line to below 1.5 degrees C, which many people on the call, their countries that have signed up to under Paris 1.5, we can do this the hard way, which is basically live in the orange and red zone for the next 30 years. This is roughly where we're heading, actually, based on current trajectories. Or we can look at what we're doing with COVID and move into the green zone and address this thing as quickly as Paris 1.5 suggests that we should. Right? And well, the other thing was going on, the reason that was possible as a thought was that people seemed to be reacting very quickly to the sense that there was this restoration happening, that within a couple of days of China turning off its factories around Wuhan, you began to see the air clearing in almost in real time, for certain things at least. And the same when traffic started slowing down in LA and Seattle. You can see these graphs for London and so on. So this sense of biodiversity sort of restoring itself almost immediately to some extent. Now, let's not overplay that, but that was really interesting and affecting to a lot of people. And you saw these pictures of Venice and other things. I used to live near Venice and I don't remember the water ever looking like that. So again, these graphs that had occurred to me that, okay, if we look at, again, this bump of Corona and the action that that causes, so the Corona bump really means a reduction in traffic straight away, almost down to negligible levels in lots of cities. What does that do? Well, one basic thing, I don't know if you can even hear the birds in the background where I'm standing, but birdsong goes up as traffic noise goes down. These are very simple things. And I don't mean to say this is all about birdsong. We just talk about biodiversity, but biodiversity increases once we start taking some of these systems that negate biodiversity out of the way. Birdsong happens to be particularly interesting because it also helps people recover from trauma, it turns out, which is a nice sort of co-benefit of this, but still. So could we, again, sort of understand what's happening with Corona and then give ourselves a choice? There's an active decision to make here. This is what governance is about. This is partly what design is about, of course, but making a decision. Cars, we hadn't really made a decision about that in 1920, 1930. It just sort of happened en masse due to various reasons. Transition theorists will tell you exactly why. But it wasn't like we had a vote saying what amount of cars should be in the city. It just filled up, almost like a gas. Now they go, there's a choice. And you can see cities like Paris and Milan beginning to quickly rebuild their streets a little bit, at least using tactical urbanism measures while the cars are away, which is incredibly interesting because it suggests there's a question in people's minds about, on the left-hand side of this graph, the level that it was before isn't something that we have to go back to necessarily. And obviously from a climate sustainability point of view, we've been motivating for this for years, but now there's a choice that we never really thought we could basically slam the handbrake on the global economy and have this opportunity to think about it. So you start thinking again, okay, these mode shift on the left-hand side, there was this amount of bikes, this amount of transit, this amount of shared mobility coming through the curve as all of those things drop around cars and shared in particular. And bikes suddenly become more viable for getting around a city in lockdown mode. What should we go back to is an active question we can ask at least. And this plays to lots of things. Many of us have been doing for years around retrofitting streets. This is stuff we did for Melbourne, but it enables us to accelerate this change. Aviation, again, something that I'd argue policymakers have never made a coherent decision about. So it's this level before going up, we used maybe the market to say supply and demand will come to a position on that. And then there was some policy maneuvers sort of to take the edge off it, if you like. But essentially it was managed through price mechanism. And of course it was going up and up. Now it's dropped to the floor. It didn't drop actively because people said we should fly less. We just dropped because we closed down borders because of Corona. Now there's a decision. Again, policymakers have never made the decision. Okay, should it be 50% of what it is before? Should it be 25% of what it was before? If you talk to the airline bosses, of course, they're saying, okay, it might be 2022 before we get back up to where we were at the same price point. And I want to ask the question, hang on, should we be doing that? Is that, we don't want that to happen for many other reasons. I say we generally, but let's say we that have signed up to Paris 1.5, we can't do that. Even with aviation only 2 to 3% of carbon emissions, it's growing so rapidly. We should be intervening on this. So what kind of question can we ask about that? The amount of food mix, someone like Sweden imports a lot of food, so we don't have that. We have 50% homegrown, 50% imported. As globalized supply chains, very fragile very quickly, we can ask a question, what percentage should it be homegrown? What should it be imported? Not to say this, there's a very dangerous logic there around increasing nationalism, increasing a kind of self-sufficiency. I'm not talking about that. I'd rather talk more about, this great feminist scholar Val Plumwood talks about shadow places, which is where Sweden, let's say, currently exports its carbon emissions to the industry and food overseas, is where the carbon happens, and we just import that in. So our carbon profile looks pretty good as Sweden, but that's because we're displacing it to the so-called shadow places. That's something we have to ethically and effectively balance better. So, but it can't be nationalism in terms of putting up walls and things. I don't think that works anymore. I think that time has gone, thankfully. Macron started talking about things like goods and services placed outside the laws of the market. This wasn't something you can imagine him saying 6 months ago at all, in these words. To say that we delegate basic things like our living environment to others is madness. He just would not have said that. So this is an interesting possibility to suggest, well, maybe there are sort of universal basic infrastructures that we put in place. I'm not really, I mean, to me, it could be universal basic income, services, infrastructures. Income, I think, is a bit problematic because it filters money and sort of increases consumption as the method, whereas infrastructure said there's almost like a bedrock of stuff down the bottom there, energy, waste, water, and so on, that people need to live with. Many countries in the world, people don't have access to those things. In America, a third of the people can afford their water payments in a state like Michigan, which is crazy that you're paying for water in the first place, but welcome to America. So you have this kind of thought. Tony Judd said, this great line, one way or another, don't privatize railways, don't nationalize sandwiches. And I've always had this in my mind as sort of a sandwiches, railways dichotomy. We're like, what kind of problem is this? So very loosely just saying there are things we could say that are basic infrastructures, which give you this living foundation. And then on top of that, you have disposable income or variable spending. The way that we live suddenly became interesting. So there was this great work 10 years ago, Post-Traumatic Urbanism by Adrian Lahoud and a team at University of Technology, Sydney, looking at cities like Beirut and Berlin about how they end up replicating structures around the place. There's a sort of redundancy on purpose. This is classic kind of network model. What that basically means is you have a hairdresser in every neighborhood. You don't just have one giant hairdresser in the middle of the city. You can't rely on that in a city like Beirut, where the roads might not be there from one day to another. So it's far more effective to have replication. It's far more diverse, it's far more interesting, it's far more creative, it's less efficient, but cities have never been about efficiency. So as we've seen now, those kind of efficiency metrics behind supply chains and urban planning are deeply problematic. They lead straight to things like Hudson Yards, completely not resilient at all. So this is in line more with this kind of 15-minute city that Paris were talking about, again, well before COVID. There are architectures that come out of this kind of work. This is the great Alvar Aalto designed Paimio Sanitarium in Finland, which came out in, let's say, 1928 after the tuberculosis and cholera outbreaks of the time. So architecture has responded many times to this kind of thing. But there's an interesting question about technology here, and I wrote a lot in the essays about indigenous technologies and, let's say, low tech, knowing that technology is just anything that people have made more or less to get something done. So on the right-hand side is the East Kolkata wetlands. It's on the edge of Calcutta. It's an amazing wetland system. It's totally a technology, as in it's designed by people. It's not naturally occurring. It uses natural processes. It's a nature-based technology. It filters sewage. So it takes 700 million tons of sewage a day, turns that into 156 tons of vegetables, 16,000 tons of fish. It employs 80,000 people. It works as natural stormwater mitigation. It doesn't increases biodiversity. It's kind of an extraordinary bit of tech, if you see it like that. On the left-hand side is the Gates Foundation funded omniprocessor coming out of the Toilet of the Future project, so hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D. It's a good thing. It turns sewage into clean drinking water, sits on the edge of Dakar, but it handles 14 tons of sewage a day. So hundreds of millions of dollars makes a machine that can do 14 tons of sewage. The one on the right, I mean, I don't know what the cost, how you'd even think about the cost in traditional economic terms. You can't really, no one's ever done that. You can't really do it. But it does 700 million tons of sewage a day. So 700 million versus 14. The one on the right does multiple other things. The one on the left just does one thing. The one on the right, again, is actually active mitigation against storms. The one on the left, you wouldn't want to stand next to in a storm because it will basically fall on you and kill you. It does one thing, right? So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It'll scale quite well in the way that the Calcutta wetlands won't, but still there's a choice here about the kind of way we think about tech. There was a lovely thing that the bushfires did in Australia. It did untold damage, of course, and it was largely terrible. But one thing it did do was that at Budj Bim in Victoria was it burnt away the topsoil and the vegetation and revealed what was effectively now known to be a 6,000-year-old eel farm. That like a machine for catching eels that Indigenous and Australians designed and made 6,000 years ago using what was very advanced engineering technology at the time. And after the bushfires, everything was stripped away and this became visible. And then it rained and the machine started working. So you can see like the water started flowing through these traps and eels started being caught. And it's going to be extraordinary, you know, like a 6,000-year-old operating system that just started booting up again like that. I mean, when Elon Musk has anything remotely like this, I will pay attention to him. But until then, he's basically useless compared to this stuff. So it's, you know, it's kind of an extraordinary way of thinking about a biodiversity generating technology, which is sustainable in a completely different way. So then having written all of that stuff and posted about it, about 2 weeks later, Danny Dorling brought out this book called Slowdown, which was super good because he's an Oxford University geography professor. So he basically did all of the data that sort of validated some of my loose hunches. So his book is about the end of this period of great acceleration, which is, let's say, the last 100 years or so of constant population growth, GDP growth, productivity growth, technology improvement, and so on. He argues using tons of data that all of that stuff has stopped, is in the process of stopping. We are now in a deceleration mode everywhere. So global population is decelerating. All of the countries you think of, like India, where you think of population increasing, actually decelerating. India has 25% population under 15. That's exactly where Japan was in 1970. In Japan in 1970 also had 25% of the population under 15. And it shows then what you all know about Japan's demographics has changed quite a lot since then. So he has all of these curves showing again, going to his website, you'll find, I mean, they're kind of mind-boggling curves, but basically when you see a spiral curling in on itself, it just means it's slowing into a position of stasis. Everything, GDP, life expectancy, population growth, technology improvement, all of those things are kind of slowing down or have stopped, and in some cases reversing. So this undercuts everything that a lot of us have been living with, this idea of constant growth, GDP, productivity improvement that we're all straining to achieve. Even things like house prices don't make sense going up when you have population going down. It's just basic supply and demand. It can't go up anymore at some point. So I took this idea for a walk. I'll just go through this very briefly and then I'll stop. Looking at our living spaces, which is my main concern, and how we live together. So looking at the context of the room and the house, based on this Eliel Saarinen quote I was just talking about. How is that changing? And I looked at this. This is a great book. There's some kind of a feminist group from the 80s called Matrix, looking at the way that domestic spaces have been designed with a certain kind of work in mind, but built around servants and women, unpaid labor or paid labor in the context of servants, but not around what we're trying to do now, which is work from home. We haven't really thought about how that happens in a meaningful way, in many, many ways. I won't go into it. there are lovely precedents for people that have thought about that. This is Sarah Wrigglesworth and Jeremy Till's house in North London, which is kind of like a studio and a garden and a living space all at the same time in a very interesting way. You can do this at the scale of public housing like this stuff in Vienna, super green, super biodiverse, places you'd actually want to live and work in the same place. I'm not saying this happens en masse, and it doesn't mean you don't also have an office, but it just changes the balance quite a lot. You could suddenly see the city centre just dropping out. This was before Boris Johnson announced the lockdown in the UK. The week before, you could already see that people just not going to the city centre. We've known this for a long time as super problematic. And there was a famous bit of research in the early 90s by Daniel Kahneman when he spoke to women in Texas about things that they enjoy doing and things that they didn't enjoy doing. Things they enjoy doing the most are intimate relations, which is kind of a euphemism for sex, I think, but there's also other nice things like that. The things they enjoyed least, the evening commute, the morning commute, the worst of all of the things in the world. So there have been cities obviously designed around that many times in the past. The Garden City, where I'm standing right now in Enjuera, where you also see the kind of wildlife returning. This is the view out my front window. But then they've also been carved apart. This was done in 1958, this huge road put through the middle of the Garden City. So this was a growth acceleration tactic. We're not in that time anymore. How do we unpick those things? There's a history again to this. This is Cedric Price's model on the left-hand side. The city is an egg, going from the kind of walled city with the yoke of the castle in the middle to what he called the fried egg of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And then he said, and then we end up with a scrambled egg where there's basically nothing. I was suggesting maybe an omelette would be a nice way to think about it. We have these concentrations of flavor distributed about this thing. So it's not just a morass of nothingness, it's full of flavor. So then how am I doing for time, Jesper? Just
your time is pretty much up, Dan. So
okay.
Type on it.
Let me just I'll skip to the end pretty quickly then. So these curves change the way we think about these patterns of development. All of them can be used to drop carbon, increase resilience, increase community. We don't need to build what we've been building. We can pull the carbon down. We have this kind of very different city in mind, not the centralized city on the left-hand side, but this decentralized city or town. There's a history of that, again, with the playgrounds of Amsterdam and after the World War II, which are distributed, so not like the Central Park model of the centralized big thing, which ends up being quite unequal, but these distributed pockets, which end up in neighborhoods. This lovely proposal by Shift about markets in Rotterdam, which are currently about social distancing, but the really interesting thing, recognizing that crowds are part of what cities are. This is Baudelaire's quote about that. Once we get back to that point, actually moving from the left-hand side of the central markets, just 3 markets in Rotterdam, to something like the right-hand side, which is multiple markets distributed, is far more equitable, sustainable, and interesting and diverse in lots of ways. So these kind of polka dot patterns become a new way of thinking. Again, maybe an old way of thinking, but it's certainly not the way from the great acceleration. So finally, I just want to end on, that actually extends well outside of cities and towns. We've seen that this hits supply chains pretty quickly. Again, these kind of over-efficient, just-in-time processes have left supply chains very fragile. There are other ways of thinking which start unlocking place-based production across a much wider network of things spread over regions and countries. This is our lovely Fab Lab in Japan, which is in the middle of nowhere, frankly. But of course, that's not the right thing to say. There's no such thing as the middle of nowhere. It's just we talk like that because it's assumed people are going to Fukuoka or Tokyo. They make this actively for you to stay there. Morakniv in Sweden, making knives for 400 years from the town of Mora, sells globally, works perfectly well, uses robots and local people to make amazing knives. Totally resilient, been doing it for 400 years. Fiskars in Finland, exactly the same. So these are not businesses that had to sell up to go to London or Istanbul or New York. They managed to stay in place. There's a long history of the resilience of those businesses. Again, in Japan, 56% of Japanese businesses take up all of the companies that are older than 200 years in the world. So Dorling points out in this book, it doesn't mean this kind of everybody has to move to the countryside or everybody moves to the city. It's just a more balanced way of approaching this pyramid. So it's not so top heavy. Banerjee and Duffler points out that people don't want to move quite often. They're perfectly happy to stay where they are. It's just the logic says you have to go to Sydney or London. That isn't the case at all when you actually ask people. And their work is basically a practice of talking and working with people on the ground. And They say very clearly, people find this so counterintuitive. If you're based in London or New York, you refuse to look at the data. So finally, does that enable a kind of a distribution across a country in a more equitable way? Does that enable us to not have regions that are depopulated, which then become thriving grounds for populist politics, which have led to Brexit and Trump and many other things besides, as we know, or the Gilets jaunes or the equivalent here in Sweden? But it enables you to find a logic which says there are big cities, there are also small towns, there are also villages, and they work together in a network-based fashion that we can put together like this. So Tokyo, to me, is still a perfect example of this slowdown city, because it's based on this polka dot model, if you like. But then so could a country like Sweden, which is the loose shape on the right-hand side there, could also work in this way, in a far more equitable, distributed way, which finds different logics for organizing stuff, not efficiency and just in time and move to the city and constant growth, but actually different types of growth outside of that. So my last point would be, slowdown doesn't mean, if I skip past lots of nice pictures of Tokyo, slowdown doesn't mean everything stops and no development. What Tokyo shows actually is constant development, just on the same plot, continually to refining itself. So I'll end here. This is Dorling's last quote. It gives us time to worry more about ourselves in a way, and less about the constant growth, that we can question things in a different way. The practice of making goods, production, the way we live, how we live together, all of those things become possible. Corona for me just threw those questions on the table, I guess. So not to say we have answers here, but we have at least choices. We should ask these questions very carefully, I guess is my point, and understand if these things are slowing down, have we genuinely recalibrated, or are we about to recalibrate the way that we organize this stuff and what we're actually striving towards? I think I'll leave it there. Jesper, sorry if I went over a bit. Thanks,
Dan, and obviously that was really insightful and impressive, and a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we'll get back to talking about those choices in the discussion after the other two interventions. For now, I want to invite in Charlie Leadbeater to kind of give his reflections on both some of your points, but also his own work in this field. Charlie.
Yeah, I'll try and share my screen. Hold on, let me see if I can. I've got some very crude slides. Can you see that? Yeah. So I want to apologize, first of all, that I've got a horrible eye infection, which makes me look a bit like Elephant Man. And unlike Dan, I've got far too many references in this to kind of dead white European males who are even older than me. But I just wanted to offer you these sorts of reflections on that. And I suppose this is kind of my first question, which is, how profound will this experience be? I mean, that sort of begs the question of what the experience is, because it will certainly come in waves, not just the virus and the health impact, but the economic and social impact. And you can already see in this country, which is a sort of poster for how not to do things, that the autumn will have there'll be a huge crunch in the autumn, because people won't be able to go back to work. The government's furlough scheme won't be sustainable, and the virus will possibly come in for a second peak, and so on and so forth. So it's going to go in waves, and it's going to affect people in places quite differently, and you already see that. So I was looking at figures yesterday suggesting that, if you're in Naples, deaths in Naples are sort of 0.2% higher than average at this time of year. Deaths in Bergamo are 586% higher than average. It's quite different, this experience, if you're in Denmark or New Zealand or Australia, or even in a funny kind of way, Greece. I'll come back to that, compared to the UK or compared to New York State. So these different, I think this is one of the big things about the whole experience, is what we and who we are make of it. And I think it's becoming increasingly evident that it's unequal, different, and with very different explanations about it. I'm struck by, I was struck by a piece I read in the New Yorker, and I'll put all the links to these pieces in the chat, but this idea from Raymond Williams that there's a sort of structure of feeling to different eras, and Williams wrote about the 60s as having a structure of feeling. I think one of the reasons why it is going to be profound is that there's a structure of feeling about this, and Dan interestingly pointed out that the feeling is very physical. It's about breathe. Although we've become more digital, actually it's all about breathing, moving. It's about very bodily things, but there's a sort of feeling of shaking, of untetheredness, of uncertainty, of possibility, all at the same time. And I think this reflecting, being, feeling has kind of broken through into politics in some kind of way. To hear Boris Johnson talk about the NHS as powered by love, to see Jacinda Ardern and others talking so openly about feeling, there's something really important about that, that feeling is, or those feelings have got into politics, feelings of care, compassion, love, as opposed to anger, hate, so on and so forth. So I think that's important. There are, I think, a sort of sense of new kinds of, a new recognition of what is valuable, which Dan talked about in that Macron quote. There's a really good piece by a guy called Will Davis at Goldsmiths about how we're all taking a kind of holiday from exchange value, and seeing value in new kinds of ways. And I think that won't go away, and the kind of questions about who we value, what we value, won't go away. And there are these very new and profound experiences of time, space, and relationships, which make us realize much more clearly what it is that we value. And by the slowdown thing, Dan is reminding us that although a big part of our experience of this is about space and movement, there is this time dimension. And if you haven't read Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time, it's a sort of destruction of the idea that time has a sort of linear kind of ordered structure. Actually, Rovelli says time is experienced in quite different ways in different places, but also moves at different speeds. And that, I think, is part of what we're being reminded of. So I think it will lead to new ideas and ideologies out of this, because it's profound. René Descartes, the first of my old European men, there's a really good book by a guy called Stephen Tolman about the ideas that Descartes was sort of central to and a part of. It's called Cosmopolis. And Tolman's interested in how the structure of ideas helps to create a sort of structure to experience, and how you move between these very macro level ideas and micro experiences. And he says you can't really understand Descartes unless you understand the 30-year war, and that Descartes went through this experience of everyone killing everyone else and not being able to trust anything, basically. And at the end of this, he comes up with this dictum, which is, I think, therefore I am. In other words, that certainty is found in yourself, not in the wider social order. And it's a kind of revolutionary idea. So it's possible, I think, that if this is a profound experience for people, then it will produce ideas as sort of revolutionary as that. Where do you find certainty? Where do you find purpose? And one way of thinking about that, and what Dan, I think, is sort of pointing us to, is whether the task of the future is to find sort of new routes on old maps, or whether it is that we need entirely new kinds of maps altogether. I think that's going to be one of the big debates. Lots of people, I think, will say, no, we've got the map, we just need a new route around coronavirus to get to our destination. And other people saying, no, we need a new map altogether. And so this is the sort of Columbus and Vespucci story. So Columbus, told to find a new route to the Indies because the Ottomans had cut off the trade routes to the east, sets off with this map which doesn't have America on it, and goes like this and sort of heads west, hoping to find a new route to the Indies, to the spices and the silks and all the rest of it, and conducts these voyages. And Amerigo Vespucci, in his wake, sets off, and he does something different. He goes like this. And Vespucci goes like this because he realizes that actually what we need is a new map. It's not a new route to an existing place on an old map. It's actually, we need a new map of possibility. And so the voyages of Columbus on the right there, the straight lines, that's a return to normal strategy. Let's find a new route to the old destination. The Vespucci journeys are a let's find a new map kind of strategy. And I think what Dan is urging us to think of is, well, how could we create these new maps? So just finally then, well, what could those new maps be, or those alternative maps? Here are just four, I think, scenarios for the future. The first is this, I'm sure we're about to be, in the UK, we're about to be engulfed by a sort of campaign to be completely normal. And the return to normality will become a sort of, not a thing that's familiar, but a sort of almost socially, sort of not enforced, but sort of promoted thing. And I think there's a growing realization that normality was a kind of form of hyper-normality. There was nothing normal about it at all. And that for me evokes this book, fantastic book about the end of the Soviet Union called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, which has this sort of idea of hyper-normality, that normality has to be so sort of contrived and constructed that you can't let it be, you have to sort of deliberately develop it. And I was very struck by a piece in the New York magazine by a restaurateur about shutting her restaurant down in the midst of COVID and losing everything that she'd built. And then halfway through the piece, she sort of starts to reflect and say, but actually the restaurant business was completely shit. You know, you couldn't make any money. The clients are awful. They're rich. They take photographs of the food before they eat it. Brunch is a dreadful invention. There's no way that we want to go back to that. So I think there will be a lot of this debate about return to normality. Was normality good or bad? So on and so forth. I think there's a second possibility, which is that actually we're not going to return to normality because this is normality. Because we're living in a kind of permanent emergency. It's the turn of the century. And however crisis or finance or migration or climate or health, actually we're going to carry on feeling these emergencies. And so one of the lessons could be you need to be permanently prepared for emergency. And the places that cope well are people and places that are permanently prepared. So one of the reasons Greece has done so well is that it's been in emergency and crisis for the last 10 years. A lot of the states in Southeast Asia have been well prepared because of SARS. So a third possibility, I think, is that we live in this sort of world of digital network fortresses where we can sort of exist within them, move outside them with track and trace apps. Other people live in the shadows of them. And the final, I suppose, that many people here might be attracted to is the notion that there could be some new political and social settlement with a much larger role for the public purpose in organizing the economy, greater equality, a more democratic settlement, a renewed public politics, so on and so forth. And you can imagine, I think, these four different, if you like, maps for our future kind of competing, I suppose. So finally, where then Dan, I think, was at his most interesting and hopeful, talking about these choices that we could make. How will they happen? Well, I think there's something interesting happening about behavior and ideas. I think a lot of us who are in the ideas business think if you get good ideas, then behavior will follow. I think what we're seeing is that behavior changes and then ideas are assembled in order to make sense of the behavior. So if you see a Conservative Chancellor basically promoting universal basic income in a form, that's what's going to happen, maybe. That actually, it's not going to be a revolution of ideas. All the ideas are already there. It's a revolution of behavior out of necessity. So I think there's something about the relationship between behavior and ideas, which is interesting. The second is, well, where would you get this opportunity that Dan talked about to make choices? And here, innovation in politics, and the question of who deliberates, how they deliberate, where they deliberate, who with, all of that becomes, I think, very important. And we need new spaces of deliberation and how that turns into action. And the final thing is that I was really struck by Dan's comments about frugal and indigenous technologies and learning from those very frugal circular systems. And I wonder whether one of the outcomes of all of this will be a recognition that, in a way, conservation, holding on to things that are valuable, will be as important as creativity. And that the new kinds of creativity we need are in some sense conservative, in the sense that they are looking after things that matter rather than creating the novel. And at that, I will leave it there.
Thanks so much, Charlie, for those kind of, in some respects, fairly practical questions. So looking forward to diving into those. And this is a setup for you maybe as well, Cassie, to kind of wrap up the panel part of this, and share your reflections. So over to you.
Thanks, Jesper. Hello, lots of people that I know. Yeah, it's a strange one going after two people that are amazing synthesizers and orators of things, and I don't have any slides, which is unlike me, but I think it's probably indicative of how little I've personally been able to slow down and reflect. So I'm just going to share some fairly jumbled thoughts. I suppose what I appreciated most about all of Dan's writing, even though, if I'm honest, I haven't even had time to properly read all of it, is just the invitation to slow down. You know, that in itself is really important. I think in kind of, you know, I was asked to think about how is our perspective changing, or is our perspective changing, or how can it change? And I suppose I've been thinking a lot about who has the time to slow down. I suppose I'm doing a job that is every day speaking to many people and organisations that are right on the front line of this crisis, and have become more and more aware of whose voice, who's thinking, whose perspective are we not hearing. So in my slowing down, in the moments I've had to slow down, I've been trying to go into spaces that I wouldn't normally go into. So I've tried to go into different online Zooms with communities that I'm not normally a part of, that I don't normally hear the perspectives of. And in my slowing down, that's been the thing I've been trying to sort of center. I think there's something about, I'm interested in like the different roles that we need at this time that I hear being spoken about less, which is things like a healer. I think there's so much trauma and grief and loss that, you know, like if we slow down, we will find it potentially really hard to avoid the immense pain and loss and trauma that is here, and that will continue and grow. So there's something that makes me sort of almost draw in a sharp breath, even at the thought of slowing down for that reason, but we need to. So I'm wondering, you know, what is that role of healing in slowing down? I'm also thinking about, certainly in my role in the lottery, like how are we, it sort of links to the first thing I said. I'm sort of going a bit all over the place here, but like, how are we building the capacity of others for slowing down and for transformation? So rather than just thinking about what are the new ideas that might emerge, before that, holding the space and building the capacity of others, that feels really important. I was on a call last week where someone really beautifully described this idea of co-sensing, which I guess you could say something like this is also doing, but where, you know, in a way we are all looking out on the same vista. So it might be this big open sea that's in front of us all, and each of us is looking through a different window, and just all of us being aware in our co-sensing, in our slowing down, in our trying to bring in different perspectives. Like, are we going and visiting other people's windows? You know, are we asking questions and looking for different kinds of data that sort of changes the shape of our window? And I just really like that as a kind of visual metaphor for thinking about how, how we can co-sense at this time. Just looking through my little notes. I mean, I think I don't really have a lot more to say. I mean, I really like Charlie's idea of permanent emergency, because again, the experience is so unequal of this. And I think there will be a lot of people in a permanent emergency for a very long time. And I think those of us that are able to slow down need to be asking, what's our role alongside those people that are going to be in a permanent emergency? I'll do.
Thanks, Cassie, and thanks for also kind of taking the perspective of kind of the nearer experiences, if you will, after the kind of the bigger picture views of Dan and Charlie. I'm going to, well, speaking of all this slowing down, I think we should slow this session down. I'm just going to sort of pick this slide back up here to guide us through the next step. So I know we usually take these sessions for about an hour, and then we enable a little bit of pausing to just for people to reflect and catch their breath. This was a lot of interesting content and thoughts, and we are looking forward to spending another 25 minutes kind of going into these. Unfortunately, Cassie can't stay with us for too long, but maybe for a little bit if we're lucky. So while you do that, we are also just going to hint that we are continuing these sessions, and next week we're going to talk about international organizations, which has not come up too much at this point. Maybe it will in the discussion, but certainly in the future of those organizations. We're joined by Avathi Krishnan and Joseph Cruz from UNDP to talk about that next week. So just as a bit of a prompter, so look out for that. But for now, thanks so much to the speakers, and thanks so much for everyone that's been joining. Hopefully you can stick around. We'll pause for a minute and then resume. So a lot of people are still here, which is great. Thank you for sticking around. And thanks again for the insightful interventions by all of you. There's been a lot of questions, and we'll try to see if we can sort of digest at least some of those into the discussion. I'm going to start with something that's also kind of was sort of prominent in several of your papers, Dan, and which also you talked about, Cassie, which is this sort of I guess paradox between connection and distance or proximity that we're currently sort of seeing. On the one hand, we are sort of keeping our social distance. On the other hand, it seems like ever before, we are craving to create those connections, whether that be to other people or to places, the places we live or want to be kind of inhabiting in a broader sense. So I wanted to sort of see if all of you can sort of maybe touch a little bit more on that. What does that mean for how we connect or going to connect in the future? And is there a particular set of lessons or insights that also you personally have sort of taken from that? Maybe Cassie, I'll start with you, and then we can work our way through.
Sorry, Jesper, I missed that.
So this point about connection versus proximity, keeping, and whether, you know, this, you talked a little bit about how this crisis is sort of illuminating both the need for connection and getting closer. You talked about kind of reaching out to unusual people, suspects, environments, for example, as one. So I'm just curious about kind of hearing a little bit more about what that kind of looks like and kind of, yeah, illustrating that a bit more. So you can talk about that.
Sorry, I was trying to write some notes in the chat, which I'll put out the window, so I wasn't paying full attention.
Oh, that's okay. Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess I can just talk very personally. I'm, you know, quite a few of my friends on this call, and they'll know the last few weeks I've not joined some of my, I feel very disconnected from my friends in some way, like I'm not attending some of the calls we've got set up on a regular basis, because in the bit of energy I have after lots of hours of working every day, I just know that I need to go and listen, like actively seek out people I don't know. So it is this very, and I'm doing that by just, you know, trawling through Twitter and just trying to find different events that I can take part in. And it is this very weird feeling for me where I feel in some ways more disconnected than ever from my friends. It's nice to see them messaging me in the chat, and but I can't, I just need to engage in like with a different group of people right now, because so much, because I can see in like the people we are connecting with, I can see is shrinking too. Like I think Elizabeth, what Charlie was saying about these sort of digital, I think we're going more into our digital bubbles. Is easier to just shrink our worlds at the minute. So I'm just trying to not do that, but in doing so I'm kind of losing my connection with my friends and things.
Interesting. Dan, Charlie, anything to add on?
Shall I go, Charlie? Yeah, it's a big question. Because I mean, for me, there's been a lot of increased interaction, a little bit like Cassie's saying, although not as, I'd say, ambitiously as Cassie's saying, with people that I don't usually speak to. So, I mean, actually more connection with old friends over things like this. But way more talking to my neighbors, which probably says a lot about how the fact that Swedes have been social distancing for 400 years. Including myself as that now, as one of those people. And of course, the Swedish, inverted commas, lockdown is a bit different to others in that we have quite a lot of freedom of movement in our neighborhoods, at least, and there's nothing to stop you doing that. So lot more walking around the neighborhood, engaging with it, walking to the forest around the corner. And I'm talking to an old lady who was just saying, "Can you hear the blackbirds?" And she said it in Swedish, and I almost understood it. Very proud moment. So it's kind of, those sort of interactions were not happening before. So that, I think, has framed a lot of my thinking about this kind of value of local coming in. And I haven't missed the city centre in that respect. My work has been very much engaged with other groups in the way that Cassie's work is as well, that aren't usually understood or listened to, particularly around food. We're doing lots of work around school food and seeing the school food system stop because the school stopped. And then that hit bits of Stockholm harder than others. And so we've done a lot of work in my day job, as it were, around getting an deeper engagement with bits of Stockholm that were revealed to be not being served by the perception of the Swedish system. And in fact, that's where the deaths have been in Sweden because of the virus, in places where there have been more new Swedes, as we call them. So there's been a lot of that in the context of the day job, and then personally a lot more talking both locally, a lot more time with family in a funny way, and then a lot more time with friends at a distance. And I felt like there was something interesting about the possibility to recalibrate the relationships accordingly. I do want to also just respect what Cassie was saying about care. That's also been kind of fundamental, and it's a little bit, I think Charlie also referred to it around maintenance and care. I think he said, or maybe I think maintenance when he says those words, I don't know. But it's those kinds of ideas becoming more and more relevant, which we know we've been talking about again for years and years, understanding the value of care and unpaid labor and so on. That has been again revealed to be highly of value right now, and just been shown that it's not necessarily reflected in the way that our systems are run. As Rowan pointed out in the chat, there's, in particular in the UK, US and Australia, there's a lot of male voices still running the show, despite that recalibration of relationships that's been happening around us. So I think that, those are, this recalibration of relationships and recalibration of value, those are the things that are really driving the way I'm thinking.
Thanks, Dan. Anything to add there, Charlie? Or?
Well, only sort of my own personal experience. Just before she died, now 10 years ago, my mum said to me in a kind of completely withering comment, "You live a very funny life," by which she meant you spend too much time traveling in airports and other places and not enough time with your family. And so I'm in a strange kind of way so glad that I'm not traveling, and I just sort of then think about this life which I chose and created of kind of going here and there and talking and all the rest of it, and just thinking, well, why on earth were you doing that? It's very interesting, but why couldn't you live well in a completely local way with a variety of more curated or chosen kind of international linkages? So amongst the things that provides a bit of a rhythm to my day is that I now make my mother-in-law's supper every night. And I'm really pleased that I have the opportunity to do that, just to be there and to show her the care that a daily kind of ritual like that kind of involves. So I think it's deepened some relationships, family relationships, some local relationships, sense of place, community, belonging, staying put. Wendell Berry writes very persuasively about all of that. And I think it's also very interesting where I don't want to go. I don't miss the centre of London at all. I have no desire to go to the centre of London. I have quite a strong desire to go and see people I work with in Denmark or Bilbao or Adelaide or what have you, but I don't have any desire to go back to the centre of London.
Thanks, Charlie. I think with those responses in mind, and I think it was a lot of kind of food for thought in terms of an individual reflection, we might kind of just pivot a little bit here and do a bit of breakouts to allow people to talk a bit more from within them, kind of in smaller groups, and then maybe come back into plenary in let's say 10 or 12 minutes or so. So thanks for that encouragement, Ernesto. But with that question and the general in mind, I'll just kind of break out into groups of 3 or 4 people for you to engage a bit more. And then we'll return at the end with Charlie and Dan and Cassie. Here we go. Happy chatting for about 10 minutes, and we'll see you back shortly.
I accidentally came back to the main room.
Oh no.
In the middle of my partner's conversation.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can allocate you back. You would have like a minute to finish up, but maybe you can connect with them afterwards.
Yeah.
Too bad. Apologies. Okay. Welcome back from the breakouts. Hopefully you had a chance to connect, hopefully also with someone you didn't speak to before. While we don't have time to answer all of the questions coming out of in your chats, I hope, but you should certainly keep holding on to those and do feed them into the chat, so at least it becomes part of our capture and we can continue the conversation beyond the session. We have about kind of 7 or 8 minutes left, and And I wanted to pick up on some of the other questions in the Zoom chat, just to hit a few of the other notes that you put in, Dan and Charlie, particularly around politics. People were, well, some questions has been around kind of, is slowdown really the right word? And as you sort of answered that a little bit, you talked about regeneration, or maybe that's not the right word either, but you talked about recalibration of values as one possible one. And I'm just thinking about the implications of this on a political level. You did talk a little bit about this, Charlie, with politics kind of grabbing onto new concepts like love, or at least in the Danish context, uncertainty is becoming a legitimate thing to talk about at this point. You also mentioned this elements around deliberation and how that might be changing, Charlie. But I'm curious about maybe hearing a little bit more about how you see, or what we can expect about to see in terms of changes in politics. I guess one element of that, which is coming up a lot, at least here in Denmark, is this talk about essential jobs or essential functions in society. And this politics of the essentials seems to be a long overdue discussion as well. So I'm curious to just kind of, both of you maybe elaborating a little bit more on what you think we can expect in terms of developments on that level, political space and decision making and so on. So I'll hand it over to you first, Dan.
I was hoping you were going to say Charlie, Jesper. No, it's
put you on the spot there.
Yeah.
Charlie, do you want to go first? I'll let you talk. I think Dan. I know Charlie is well prepared for this.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the first thing that's really striking is the complete lack of innovation in politics. Certainly in this country, you're getting a kind of wall of government kind of push and campaigning, and then the offer of some sort of inquiry afterwards, which might report in 3 years on some sort of limited lessons. So there's this tremendous sense, I think, of political stasis. What might unlock that, and I think it could go in many different directions. I mean, looking at what's happening in the States is deeply alarming. Looking at the sort of the way that it's being taken by authoritarians in parts of Europe is deeply alarming. But there are two things, maybe three things, which I think are really potentially hopeful. One is this alliance that you talked about, Jesper, about essential workers, core work, the value of work, so on and so forth, and the whole approach to work, the labour market, value, people, all of that. That could be really fruitful, I think, and a sense of realignment around that and resetting. And that might create a new kind of movement, perhaps. The second would be, it won't happen unless people create it, is new spaces for deliberation to collectively, as Cassie was talking about, collectively make sense of what this experience has been, where those spaces for deliberation could be, how they could be created by culture, by social entrepreneurs, by local organizations, and how you could start doing that now, not wait till it's over, start doing it now. And then the third would be this sort of coming together of ideas around care, I suppose, care for community, care for people, care for the environment, of a new kind of ethic, trying to guide the economy and do what Dan was talking about, which is sort of connecting this to these wider agendas and creating a sense of sort of forward momentum with it. That then might create the basis for a different kind of political alignment. But I think the biggest advocates of the return to normal are politicians.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Charlie. I've seen surveys done in the UK, obviously, and there's been less done on that here in Sweden, just again because we're handling it in a different way. But the RSA, I think, commissioned a survey about people's perception about whether we should return back to normal. I mean, it's not quite framed exactly how you would want it. Sometimes it's framed as, should we reopen the economy and stop the lockdown? Or other times it's, do you want to return back to normal? But they seem to be almost overwhelmingly, no, we don't want to go back. We might want to reopen, but as something else. And that's not understood what that could be, but still. Whereas, as you say, at the big P political level, it's just reopen what we had before. And there's no sense of a change, except perhaps, sort of Johnson admitting he discovered society while he was probably under anesthetic. So I think there's this huge disparity between those things. I think it's just briefly on Sweden, and I'm sure a lot of you know we've handled it in this different way, or arguably handled it. But that's relied a lot on a few things which are interesting. One is this sort of very distributed, decentralized model in Sweden, where the national government doesn't really even have a legal right to issue a lockdown, because there's so much power at the sort of municipal and regional level. And then it relies heavily on a sense of trust and mutual respect and things like that. And Sweden sort of scores traditionally highly for that in all directions almost. And that sort of works clearly, and in some way you can see that happening. That effectively the Prime Minister said things like, now is the time for adults to behave like adults. It's sort of that language, almost like admonishing you in case you did something wrong. But basically use social norms rather than rules, which is very different to, say, somewhere like Italy, for instance, where I had a chat with a friend of mine who lives in Milan the other day, who just got fined €300 for having a cup of coffee. And it wasn't even a nice coffee. So using kind of law to exert the lockdown in that way seemed really telling, I think. And so the issue with the Swedish one, where it hasn't worked, is again at the edges of that understanding. One thing you can say is almost too much faith in science in a funny way, whereas in other countries there's not enough. Here it's a very technocratic thing, and the state epidemiologist is basically making all of the decisions as far as we can tell. Like, he and his team are the one that are on the TV every day, not the Prime Minister or the Health Minister. And you think, epidemiology is very good for stopping a virus, arguably, but is that a rich enough decision-making culture? Probably not, to handle something as complex as this. The second thing is this kind of distributed governance model and how much we can push on that. So the things we were doing already around that were the street project I alluded to briefly. We're looking at how do we retrofit all the streets in Sweden in favor of biodiversity and things that aren't traffic, would be the shorthand. But that includes throwing over the governance of the street to the street as much as humanly possible. So understanding there are sort of scales of decision making, and I know I was talking in a very spatial way, but there are scales of decision making that could be very distributed down. So can you let the street decide what happens in the street, given a kind of overall framework which is within planetary boundaries, that kind of language. And that's something we're already pushing on quite a lot there, which will enable you to do this much more distributed and diverse sense of decision making, genuine ownership, which is the highest level of the participation ladder that Sherry Armstrong did. So that's something that we're pushing towards, which maybe in this sense of recalibration, we have even more reason to do that now. So yeah, the issue where the Swedish model broke down was, again, not understanding the diversity of society that's in Sweden now. So not dealing with Somali Swedes, say, and communicating using media that Somali Swedes read and watch. There's just sort of an assumption that everybody will read Dagens Nyheter, which is the traditional Swedish newspaper. And that's just a huge failing, like a classic awful service design fail, which resulted in lives lost. There's no excuse for that. But if you took those things out, the reliance on trust seemed quite effective. And finally, perhaps where the other deaths have been in Sweden have been in the care homes for the elderly. And that has been, in recent years, outsourced into private ownership in a sort of, dare I say, UK model. And that's now, sort of seeing the way that care was not prioritized, where people weren't trained well and that was being run for profit effectively, just hasn't worked, again, leading to loss of life. So there's a really interesting conversation now in Sweden about the stuff that worked within the model. And then we have a relatively high proportion of deaths, less than the UK, but way more than Norway, Finland and Denmark, And that's because of things like outsourcing towards private care and then not dealing with diversity. So all of those things are really interesting in terms of there's a different type of politics required, which builds on science, builds on trust, but also is built around diversity and more distributed model, even in for Sweden, and a sense that care and value are so important, you can't run them for private profit. That's sort of something we can put on the table about different type of decision making, perhaps.
Thanks so much, both. I think both of these were kind of, in some respects, hopeful and practical agendas to hopefully kind of continue to pursue. I want to thank you both and all of you for a rich discussion. Hopefully we've lived up to a promise that we are still remaining with more questions than answers in these times, which I think is the right place to be, and hopefully they are becoming prompts for reflection, creative exploration, and further continuous learning. But thanks again, and we'll back next week as previously mentioned. And until then, take care, and I was about to say God bless, but something else than that.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands. But just take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
We'll understand it all by and by. Cheer up.